Aircraft and Flight: The Complete and Unbiased Brief History. An audiovisual presentation by Hector V. Material from public domain sources, primarily wikipedia.org. Recorded June 2016. Introduction. The history of aviation has extended over more than 2,000 years, from the earliest forms of aviation, kites and attempts at tower jumping, to supersonic and hypersonic flight by powered heavier-than-air jets. Kite flying in China dates back to several hundred years BC and slowly spread around the world. It is thought to be the earliest example of man-made flight. Some kites in China and Japan were capable of carrying a man into the air. The ancient Chinese also flew small hot air lanterns and bamboo copter toys with spinning rotors. Leonardo da Vinci's 15th century dream of flight found expression in several rational but unscientific designs, though he did not attempt to construct any of them. The discovery of hydrogen gas in the 18th century led to the invention of the hydrogen balloon, at almost exactly the same time that the Montgolfier brothers discovered the hot air balloon and began manned flights. Various theories in mechanics by physicists during the same time period, notably fluid dynamics and Newton's law of motion, led to the foundation of modern aerodynamics, most notably by Sir George Cayley. Balloons, both free-flying and tethered, began to be used for military purposes from the end of the 18th century, with the French government establishing balloon companies during the Revolution. The term aviation, noun of action, from stem of Latin avis, bird, was coined in 1863 by French pioneer Guillaume Joseph Gabriel de la Landelle, 1812 to 1886, en navigation aérienne. Experiments with gliders provided the groundwork for heavier-than-air craft, and by the early 20th century, advances in engine technology and aerodynamics made controlled powered flights possible for the first time. The modern airplane, with its characteristic tail, was established by 1909, and from then on, the history of the aeroplane became tied to the development of more and more powerful engines. The first great ships of the air were the rigid dirigible balloons pioneered by Zeppelin, which soon began synonymous with airships and dominated long-distance flights until the 1930s, when large flying boats became popular. After World War II, the flying boats were in their turn replaced by land planes, and the new and immensely powerful jet engine revolutionized both air travel and military aviation. In the latter part of the 20th century, the advent of digital electronics produced great advances in flight instrumentation and fly-by-wire systems. The 21st century saw the large-scale use of pilotless drones for military, civilian, and leisure use. Primitive beginnings. Tower jumping. Daedalus working on Icarus wings. The origin of mankind's desire to fly is lost in the distant past. From the earliest legends, there have been stories of men strapping bird-like wings, stiffened cloaks, or other devices to themselves and attempting to fly, typically by jumping off a tower. The Greek legend of Daedalus and Icarus is one of the earliest known. Others originated from India, China, and the European Dark Ages. During this early period, the issues of lift, stability, and control were not understood, and most attempts ended in serious injury or death. In medieval Europe, the earliest recorded tower jump dates from 852 AD, when Armand Furman made a jump in Cordoba, Spain, reportedly covering his body with vulture feathers and attaching two wings to his arms. Elmer of Malmesbury soon followed, and many others have continued to do so over the centuries. As late as 1811, Albrecht Berblinger constructed an ornithopter and jumped into the Danube at Ulm. Kites. The kite may have been the first form of man-made aircraft. It was invented in China possibly as far back as the 5th century BC by Mo Di and Konshuban. Later designs often emulated flying insects, birds, and other beasts, both real and mythical. Some were fitted with strings and whistles to make musical sounds while flying. Ancient and medieval Chinese sources describe kites being used to measure distances, test the wind, lift man, signal, and communicate and send messages. kites spread from China around the world. After its introduction into India, the kite further evolved into the fighter kite, where an abrasive line is used to cut down other kites. Man-carrying kites are believed to have been used extensively in ancient China for both civil and military purposes, and sometimes enforced as a punishment. An early recorded flight was that of the prisoner Yuan Hangtou, a Chinese prince, in the 6th century AD. Stories of man-carrying kites also occur in Japan, following the introduction of the kite from China around the 7th century AD. It is said that at one time there was a Japanese law against man-carrying kites. Rotor wings. The use of a rotor for vertical flight has existed since 400 BC in the form of the bamboo copter, an ancient Chinese toy. The similar moulinet à nux, rotor on a nut, appeared in Europe in the 14th century AD. Hot air balloons. A sky lantern. From ancient Chinese times, they have understood that hot air rises and have applied the principle to a type of small hot air balloon called the sky lantern. A sky lantern consists of a paper balloon under or just inside which a small lamp is placed. Sky lanterns are traditionally launched for pleasure and during festivals. According to Joseph Needham, such lanterns were known in China from the 3rd century BC. Their military use is attributed to General Zhuge Liang, 180 to 234 AD. The horrific title, Kong Ming, who is said to have used them to scare the enemy troops. There is evidence that the Chinese also solved the problem of aerial navigation using balloons hundreds of years before the 18th century. Renaissance, one of Leonardo's sketches. Eventually, some investigators began to discover and define some of the basics of rational aircraft design. Most notable of these was Leonardo da Vinci, although his work remained unknown until 1797, and so had no influence on developments over the next 300 years. While his designs were at least rational, they were not based on any particular good science. Leonardo studied bird flight, analyzing it and anticipating many principles of aerodynamics. He did at least understand that an object offers as much resistance to the air as the air does to the object. Newton would not publish the third law of motion until 1687. From the last years of the 15th century on, he wrote about and sketched many designs for flying machines and mechanisms, including ornithopters, fixed-wing gliders, rotorcraft, and parachutes. His early designs were man-powered types, including ornithopters and rotorcraft. However, he came to realize the impracticality of this and later turned to controlled gliding flights, also sketching some designs powered by a spring. Lighter than air. Beginnings of modern theory. In 1670, Francesco Lana de Terzi published a work that suggested lighter than air flight would be possible by using copper foil spheres that, containing a vacuum, would be lighter than the displaced air to lift an airship. While theoretically sound, his design was not feasible. The pressure of the surrounding air would crush the spheres. The idea of using vacuum to produce lift is now known as vacuum airship, but remains unfeasible with any current materials. In 1709, Bartolomeu de Gusmão presented a petition to King John V of Portugal, begging for his support for his invention of an airship, in which he expressed the greatest confidence. The public test of the machine, which was set for June 24, 1709, did not take place. According to the contemporary reports, however, Gusmão appears to have made several less ambitious experiments with this machine, descending from eminences. It is certain that Gusmão was working on this principle at the public exhibition he gave before the court on August 8, 1709 in the hall of the Casa da India in Lisbon, when he propelled a ball to the roof by combustion. Balloons. In 1783, it was a watershed year for ballooning and aviation. Between June 4th and December 1st, 5 aviation firsts were achieved in France. On the 4th of June, the Montgolfier brothers demonstrated unmanned hot air balloon at Annonay, France. On 27th August, Jack Charles and Robert Brothers, Les Frères Robert, launched the world's first unmanned hydrogen-filled balloon from the Champ de Mars, Paris. On 19th October, the Montgolfier brothers launched the first manned flight, a tethered balloon with humans on board, at the Folie Titan in Paris. The aviators were the scientists Jean-Francois Pilatre de Rosière, manufacturer manager Jean-Baptiste Réveillon, and Gerard de Villiers. On 21st November, the Montgolfier brothers launched the first free flight with humans as passengers. King Louis XIV had originally decreed that condemned criminals would be the first pilots, but Jean de Francois Pilatre de Rosière, along with Marquis Francois de Hollandaise, successfully petitioned for the honor. They drifted 8 kilometers, or 5 miles, in a balloon powered by a wood fire. On the 1st of December, Jacques Charles and Nicolas Louis Robert launched their manned hydrogen balloon from the Jardin des Tuileries in Paris amid a crowd of 400,000. They ascended to a height of about 1,800 feet, or 550 meters, and landed at sunset, Nesles-la-Vallée, after a flight of 2 hours and 5 minutes, covering 36 kilometers. After Robert aligned, Charles decided to ascend alone. This time, he ascended rapidly to an altitude of about 9,800 feet, 3,000 meters, where he saw the sun again, suffered extreme pain in his ears, and never flew again. Ballooning became a major rage in Europe in the late 18th century, providing the first detailed understanding of the relationship between altitude and the atmosphere. Work on developing a steerable or dirigible balloon, now called an airship, continued sporadically throughout the 19th century. The first powered, controlled, sustained lighter-than-air flight is believed to have taken place in 1852, when Henry Giffard flew 15 miles, or 24 kilometers, in France with a steam engine-driven craft. Non-steerable balloons were employed during the American Civil War by the Union Army Balloon Corps. The young Ferdinand von Zeppelin first flew as balloon passenger with the Union Army at the Potomac in 1863. In the early 1900s, ballooning was a popular sport in Britain. These privately owned balloons usually used coal gas as the lifting gas. This has half the lifting power of hydrogen, so the balloons had to be larger. However, coal was far more readily available, and the local gas works sometimes provided by a special lightweight formula for ballooning events. Airships. Santos Dumont No. 6, rounding the Eiffel Tower, in the process of winning the Duche de la Morte Prize, October 1901. Airships were originally called dirigible balloons and are still sometimes called dirigibles today. Another advance was made in 1884 when the first fully controllable free flight was made in a French Army electric-powered airship, La France, by Charles Renard and Arthur Krebs. The 170-foot or 52-meter long, 66,000 cubic foot, 1,900 cube meters airship covered 8 kilometers or 5 miles in 23 minutes with the aid of an 8.5 horsepower electric motor. However, these aircraft were generally short-lived and extremely frail. Routine controlled flights would not occur until the advent of the internal combustion engine. The first aircraft to make routine controlled flights were non-rigid airships, sometimes called blimps. The most successful early pioneering pilot of this type of aircraft was the Brazilian Alberto Santos Dumont, who effectively combined a balloon with an internal combustion engine. On 19th October 1901, he flew his airship, No. 6, over Paris from the Parc de Saint-Cloud around the Eiffel Tower and back in under 30 minutes to win the Duche de la Morte Prize. Santos Dumont went on to design and build several aircraft. Subsequent controversies surrounding his and others' competing claims with regard to aircraft overshadowed his great contribution to the development of airship. At the same time that non-rigid airships were starting to have some success, the first successful rigid airships were also being developed. These would be far more capable than fixed-wing aircraft in terms of pure cargo carrying capacity for decades. Rigid airship design and advancement was pioneered by the German Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin. Construction of the first Zeppelin airship began in 1899 in a floating assembly hall on Lake Constance in the Bay of Menzel, Friedrichshafen. This was intended to ease the starting procedure, as the hull could easily be aligned with the wind. The prototype airship LZ-1, LZ for Luftschiff Zeppelin, had a length of 128 meters or 420 feet, was driven by two 10.6 kilowatt or 14.2 horsepower Daimler engines and balanced by moving a weight between its two nacelles. Its first flight on July 2nd, 1900 lasted for only 18 minutes, as LZ-1 was forced to land on the lake after the winding mechanism for the balancing weight had broken. Upon repair, the technology proved its potential in subsequent flights, bettering 6 meters per second speed attained by the French airship La France by 3 meters per second, but could not yet convince possible investors. It would be several years before the Count was able to raise enough funds for another try. Although airships were used both in World War I and II and continue on a limited basis to this day, their development was largely overshadowed by heavier than air craft. Heavier than air. The 17th and 18th centuries. Traveler Evliya Celebi reported that in 1633, Ottoman scientist and engineer Lagari Hassan Celebi blasted off from Sarayburnu in a 7-winged rocket propelled by 50 oka, 140 pounds of gunpowder. The flight was said to have been undertaken at the time of the birth of Sultan Murad IV's daughter. As Evliya Celebi wrote, Lagari proclaimed before launching his craft, "Oh, my Sultan, be blessed. I am going to talk to Jesus." After ascending in the rocket, he landed in the sea, swimming ashore and joking, "Oh, my Sultan, Jesus sends his regards to you." He was rewarded by the Sultan with silver and the rank of Sipahi in the Ottoman army. Evliya Celebi also wrote of Lagari's brother, Hezarfen Ahmed Celebi, making a flight by glider a year earlier. Italian inventor Tito Livio Burattini, invited by the Polish king Ladislaw IV to his court in Warsaw, built a model aircraft with 4 fixed glider wings in 1647. Described as 4 pairs of wings attached to an elaborate dragon, it was said to have successfully lifted a cat in 1648, but not Burattini himself. He promised that only the most minor injuries would result from landing the craft. His Dragon Volant is considered the most elaborate and sophisticated aeroplane to be built before the 19th century. Sketch of a machine for flying in the air. The first published paper on aviation was Sketch of a Machine for Flying in the Air by Emanuel Swedenborg, published in 1716. This flying machine consisted of a light frame covered with strong canvas and provided with 2 large oars or wings moving on a horizontal axis, arranged so that the upstroke met with no resistance while the downstroke provided lifting power. Swedenborg knew that the machine would not fly, but suggested it as a start and was confident that the problem would be solved. He wrote, "It seems easier to talk of such machine than to put it into actuality, but it requires greater force and less weight than exists in a human body. The science of mechanics might perhaps suggest a means, namely a strong spiral spring. If these advantages and requisites are observed, perhaps in time to come someone might know how better to utilize our sketch and cause some addition to be made so as to accomplish that which we can only suggest. Yet there are sufficient proofs and examples from nature that such flights can take place without danger, although when the first trials are made, you may have to pay for the experience and not mind an arm or leg." Swedenborg would prove prescient in his observation that a method of powering an aircraft was one of the critical problems to overcome. The 19th century. Throughout the 19th century, tower jumping was replaced by the equally fatal but equally popular balloon jumping as a way to demonstrate the continued uselessness of manpower and flapping wings. Meanwhile, the scientific study of heavier-than-air flight began in earnest. Sir George Cayley and the first modern aircraft. Sir George Cayley was the first father of the aeroplane in 1846. During the last years of the previous century, he had begun the first rigorous study of the physics of flight and would later design the first modern heavier-than-air craft. Among his many achievements, his most important contributions to aeronautics include clarifying our ideas and laying down the principles of heavier-than-air flight, reaching a scientific understanding of the principles of bird flight, conducting scientific aerodynamic experiments demonstrating drag and streamlining movement of the center of pressure, and the increase in lift from curving the wing surface, defining the modern airplane configuration comprising a fixed wing, fuselage, and tail assembly. Demonstration of manned gliding flight, setting out the principles of power to weight ratio in sustaining flight. Cayley's first innovation was to study the basics science of lift and adopting the whirling arm test rig for use in aircraft research and using simple aerodynamic models on the arm rather than attempting to fly a model of a complete design. In 1799, he set down the concept of the modern airplane as a fixed wing flying machine with separate systems for lift, propulsion, and control. In 1804, Cayley constructed a model glider, which was the first modern heavier-than-air flying machine, having the layout of a conventional modern aircraft with an inclined wing towards the front and adjustable tail at the back with both tailplane and fin. A movable weight allowed adjustment of the model's center of gravity. The governable parachute design of 1852. In 1809, goaded by the farcical antics of his contemporaries, he began a publication of a landmark three-part treatise titled On Aerial Navigation, 1809 to 1810. In it, he wrote the first scientific statement of the problem. The whole problem is confined within these limits, viz., to make a surface support a given weight by the application of power to the resistance of air. He identified the four vectors forces that influence an aircraft: thrust, lift, drag, and weight, and distinguished stability and control in his designs. He also identified and described the importance of the cambered aerofoil, dihedral, diagonal bracing, and drag reduction, and contributed to the understanding and design of ornithopters and parachutes. In 1848, he had progressed far enough to construct a glider in the form of a triplane large and safe enough to carry a child. A local boy was chosen, but his name is not known. He went on to publish in 1852 the design for a full-size manned glider or governable parachute to be launched from a balloon, and then to construct a version capable of launching from the top of a hill, which carried the first adult aviator across Brompton Dale in 1853. Minor inventions included the rubber-powered motor, which provided a reliable power source for research models. By 1808, he had even reinvented the wheel, devising the tension-spoked wheel, in which all compression loads are carried by the rim, allowing a lightweight undercarriage. The Age of Steam. Drawing directly from Cayley's work, Henson's 1842 design for an aerial steam carriage broke new ground. Although only a design, it was the first in history for a propeller-driven fixed-wing aircraft. In 1866, the founding of the Aeronautical Society of Great Britain, and 2 years later, the world's first aeronautical exhibition was held at the Crystal Palace, London, where John Stringfellow was awarded £100 prize for the steam engine with the best power-to-weight ratio. Francis Herbert Wenham presented the first paper to the newly formed Aeronautical Society, later the Royal Aeronautical Society, on aerial locomotion. He advanced Cayley's work on cambered wings, making important findings. To test his ideas from 1858, he had constructed several gliders from manned and unmanned, and with up to 5 stacked wings. He realized that long, thin wings are better than bat-like ones because they have more leading edge for the area. Today, this relationship is known as the aspect ratio of a wing. The latter part of the 19th century became a period of intense study, characterized by the gentlemen scientists who represented most research efforts until the 20th century. Among them was the British scientist, philosopher, and inventor Matthew Piers Watt Boulton, who studied lateral flight control and was the first to patent an aileron control system in 1868. In 1871, Wenham and Browning made the first wind tunnel. Felix du Temple's 1874 monoplane, shown in the picture in the center. Meanwhile, the British advances had galvanized French researchers. In 1857, Felix du Temple proposed a monoplane with a tail plane and retractable undercarriage, developing his ideas with a model powered first by clockwork and later by steam. He eventually achieved a short hop with a full-sized manned aircraft in 1874.
The monoplane. In 1874, the two brothers built the monoplane, a large plane made of aluminum in Brest, France, with a wingspan of 13 meters and a weight of only 80 kilograms without the pilot. Several trials were made with the plane, and it is generally recognized that it achieved liftoff under its own power after a ski jump run, glided for a short time, and returned safely to ground, possibly making it the first successful powered flight in history, depending on the definition, since the flight was only a short distance and a short time. The plane was displayed at the 1878 World Fair, Exposition Universelle 1878 in Paris.
In 1856, Frenchman Jean-Marie Lebris made the first flight higher than his point of departure by having his glider, l'Albatros Artificiel, pulled by a horse on a beach. He reportedly achieved a height of 100 meters over a distance of 200 meters. Plano 4 model airplane by Alphonse Penaud, 1871, shown in the picture on the left side. Alphonse Penaud, a Frenchman living from 1850 to 1880, advanced the theory of wing contours and aerodynamics and constructed successful models of aeroplanes, helicopters, and ornithopters. In 1871, he flew the first aerodynamically stable fixed-wing aeroplane, a model monoplane he called the Plano 4, a distance of 40 meters, 130 feet. Penaud's model incorporated several Cayley's discoveries, including the use of a tail wing dihedral for inherent stability and rubber power. The Plano 4 also had longitudinal stability, being trimmed such that the tailplane was set at a smaller angle of incidence than the wings, an original and important contribution to the theory of aeronautics. Penaud's later project for an amphibian aeroplane, although never built, incorporated other modern features: a tailless monoplane with a single vertical fin and twin tractor propellers. It also featured hinged rear elevator and rudder surfaces, retractable undercarriage, and a fully enclosed instrumented cockpit. Equally authoritative as a theorist was Penaud's fellow countryman, Victor Totin. In 1879, he flew a model which, like Penaud's project, was a monoplane with twin tractor propellers, but also had a separate horizontal tail. It was powered by compressed air, flown tethered to a pole. This was the first model to take off under its own power. In 1884, Alexander Goupil published his work, La locomotion aérienne, aerial locomotion, although the flying machine he later constructed failed to fly. Clement Audin, Aviation 3, photograph shown on the right side of the screen. In 1890, the French engineer Clement Audin completed the first of 3 steam-driven flying machines, the AO. On October 9, 1890, Audin made an uncontrolled hop of around 50 meters, or 165 feet. This was the first manned airplane to take off under its own power. His Aviation 3 in 1897, notable only for having twin steam engines, failed to fly. Audin would later claim his success and was not debunked until 1910, when the French Army published its report on his attempt. Sir Hiram Maxim was an American engineer who had moved to England. He built his own whirling arm rig and wind tunnel, and constructed a large machine with a wingspan of about 105 feet, 32 meters, a length of 145 feet, 44 meters, fore and aft horizontal surfaces, and a crew of 3, twin propellers were powered by two lightweight compound steam engines, each delivering 180 horsepower or 130 kilowatts. Overall weight was 8,000 pounds, 3,600 kilograms. It was intended as a test rig to investigate aerodynamic lift. Lacking flight controls, it ran on rails with a second set of rails above the wheels to restrain it. Completed in 1894, on its third run, it broke from the rail, became airborne for several hundred feet at 2 to 3 feet altitude, and was badly damaged upon falling back to the ground. It was subsequently repaired, but Maxim abandoned his experiments shortly afterwards. Learning to glide. The Biot Massa glider, restored and on display at the Musée de l'Air in the last decade or so of the 19th century, a number of key figures were refining and defining the modern airplane. Lacking a suitable engine, aircraft work focused on stability and control of gliding flight. In 1879, Biot constructed a bird-like glider with the help of Massa and flew it briefly. It is preserved in the Musée de l'Art, France, and is claimed to be the earliest man-carrying flying machine still in existence. The Englishman Horatio Phillips made key contributions to aerodynamics. He conducted extensive wind tunnel research on aerofoil sections, providing the principles of aerodynamic lift foreseen by Cayley and Wenham. His findings underpin all modern aerofoil design. Otto Lilienthal, shown in the picture on the right side of the screen, May 29, 1895, became known as the Glider King or Flying Man of Germany. He duplicated Wenham's work and greatly expanded on it in 1884, publishing his research in 1889, Bird Flight as the Basis of Aviation. He also produced a series of hang gliders, including batwing, monoplane, and biplane forms, such as the Derwitzer glider and normal soaring apparatus. Starting in 1891, he became the first person to make controlled untethered glides routinely, and the first to be photographed flying a heavier-than-air machine. Stimulating interest around the world, he rigorously documented his work, including photographs, and for this reason is one of the best known of the early pioneers. Lilienthal made over 2,000 glides until his death in 1896 from injuries sustained in a glider crash. Picking up where Lilienthal left off, Octave Chanute took up aircraft design as an early retirement. He funded the development of several gliders. In the summer of 1896, his team flew several of their designs, eventually deciding that the best was a biplane design. Like Lilienthal, he documented and photographed his work. In Britain, Percy Pilcher, who had worked for Maxim, built and successfully flew several gliders during the mid to late 1890s. The invention of the box kites during this period by the Australian Lawrence Hargrave would lead to the development of the practical biplane. In 1894, Hargrave linked 4 of his kites together, added a sling seat, and flew 16 feet or 4.9 meters. Later pioneers of manned kite flying included Samuel Franklin Cody in England and Captain Jeannie Sacconi in France. Langley. Shown on the screen, the first failure of Langley's manned aerodrome on the Potomac River, October 7, 1903. After a distinguished career in astronomy and shortly before becoming secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Samuel Pierpont Langley started a serious investigation into aerodynamics at what is today the University of Pittsburgh. In 1891, he published Experiments in Aerodynamics detailing his research, and then turned to building his designs. He hoped to achieve automatic aerodynamic stability, so he gave little consideration to in-flight control. On May 6, 1896, Langley's Aerodome No. 5 made the first successful sustained flight of an unpiloted, engine-driven, heavier-than-air craft of substantial size. It was launched from a spring-actuated catapult mounted on top of a houseboat on the Potomac River near Quantico, Virginia. 2 flights were made that afternoon, one of 1,005 meters, 3,297 feet, and a second of 700 meters, 2,300 feet, at a speed of approximately 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour. On both occasions, the Aerodrome number 5 landed in the water as planned, because in order to save the weights, it was not equipped with landing gear. On November 28, 1896, another successful flight was made with the Aerodrome number 6. This flight, 1,460 meters, was witnessed and photographed by Alexander Graham Bell. The Aerodrome number 6 was actually Aerodrome number 4 greatly modified, so little remained of the original aircraft that it was given a new designation. With the successes of the Aerodrome number 5 and number 6, Langley started looking for funding to build a full-scale man-carrying version of his designs. Spurred by the Spanish-American War, the U.S. government granted him $50,000 to develop a man-carrying flying machine for aerial reconnaissance. Langley planned on building a scaled-up version known as the Aerodrome A, and started with the smaller quarter-scale Aerodrome, which flew twice on June 18, 1901, and then again with a newer and more powerful engine in 1903. Manley. With the basic design apparently successfully tested, he then turned to the problem of a suitable engine. He contracted Stephen Balzer to build one, but was disappointed when it delivered only 8 horsepower, 6.0 kilowatts, instead of the 12 horsepower, 8.9 kilowatt he expected. Langley's assistant, Charles M. Manley, then reworked the design into a 5-cylinder water-cooled radial that delivered 52 horsepower, 39 kilowatts at 950 RPM, a feat that took years to duplicate. Now, with both power and design, Langley put the two together with great hopes. To his dismay, the resulting aircraft proved to be too fragile. Simply scaling up the original small models resulted in a design that was too weak to hold itself together. 2 launches in the late 1903 both ended with the Aerodrome immediately crashing into the water. The pilot, Manley, was rescued each time. Also, the aircraft's control system was inadequate to allow quick pilot responses, and it had no method of lateral control, and the Aerodrome's aerial stability was marginal. Langley's attempts to gain further funding failed, and his efforts ended. 9 days after his second abortive launch on December 8th, the Wright brothers successfully flew their flyer. Glenn Curtiss made 93 modifications to the Aerodrome and flew this very different aircraft in 1914. Without acknowledging the modifications, the Smithsonian Institution asserted that Langley's Aerodrome was the first machine capable of flight. Whitehead. As shown on the screen, top left, the number 1 monoplane seen from the rear. Whitehead sits beside it with daughter Rose in his lap. Others in the photo are not identified. Gustav Weibkopf was a German who emigrated to the United States, where he soon changed his name to Gustav Whitehead. From 1897 to 1915, he designed and built early flying machines and engines. On August 14, 1901, 2.5 years before the Wright brothers' flight, he claimed to have carried out a controlled, powered flight in his number 21 monoplane at Fairfield, Connecticut. The flight was reported in the Bridgeport Sunday Herald local newspaper. About 30 years later, several people, questioned by a researcher, claimed to have seen that or other Whitehead flights. In March 2013, the Jane's All of the World's Aircraft, an authoritative source for contemporary aviation, published an editorial which accepted Whitehead's flight as the first manned, powered, controlled flight of a heavier-than aircraft. The Smithsonian Institution, custodians of the original Wright flyer from the Wright brothers, and many aviation historians continue to maintain that Whitehead did not fly as suggested. Shown on the lower right is an alleged photo of the actual flying machines. The flying machine in action. In other words, it is a alleged original photo of the actual machine flying Whitehead's number 21 monoplane.
Shivkar Varpuji Talpade. Talpade is claimed to have constructed an unmanned heavier-than-air aircraft named Marutsaka, Friend of the Air, and flown it above Bombay's Chowpatty Beach in 1895. Contemporary accounts of a successful flight do not exist, and no reliable historical records document its existence. Talpade's aircraft was reputed to have flown to a height of 1,500 feet that's 460 meters. Pratap Velkar, a local architect who has researched Kalpaday's life and written a book about him, denies this, stating that it rose to a small height before crashing. The aircraft has been described as a cylinder of bamboo, with claims it used mercury or urine as fuel. Some of Kalpaday's drawings were said to have been sent to Hindustan Aeronautics, HAL, but Anuradha Reddy, a historian of aviation, was unable to trace them. The aircraft itself has been described as being sold to Wright Brothers, or to HAL. Some accounts of the event stated that the flight was watched by Sayajirao Gaikwad III, then the Maharaja of Baroda, but direct evidence for this is scant. Velkar states that no royals attended, as it was not well publicized. Some versions of the story say that Kalpaday had advised from Subbaraya Shastri, 1866 to 1940, who later wrote Vaimanika Shastra, Science of Aeronautics, a text that is frequently associated with descriptions of aircraft in the Vedas. Pearce. Richard Pearce was a New Zealand farmer and inventor who performed pioneering aviation experiments. Witnesses interviewed many years afterward claimed that Pearce flew and landed a powered heavier-than-air machine on 31st March 1903, 9 months before the Wright brothers flew. Documentary evidence for these claims remain open to interpretation and dispute, and Pearce himself never made such claims. In a newspaper interview in 1909, he said he did not attempt anything practical until 1904. If he did fly in 1903, the flight appears to have been poorly controlled in comparison to the Wrights.